The glass windows of Carter and Company. Retail shimmered under the bright city lights, proudly displaying the company's latest seasonal promotions. David Carter, the man whose name the company bore, stood across the street, staring at his own creation with an unfamiliar feeling, a gnawing sense of doubt. For years, he had been celebrated as a visionary CEO, a business mogul who had turned a struggling franchise into a household name. Profits soared, investors were satisfied, and expansion was constant. But lately, something had begun to unsettle him. Social media was littered with complaints, not from customers, but from employees. Anonymous posts spoke of exhaustion, unlivable wages, and a toxic work environment. The voices were growing louder, and no amount of PR spin could silence them. His executive team dismissed the concerns. Disgruntled employees will always complain. One board member had scoffed in a recent meeting. If they don't like it, they can leave. David had nodded at the time, but something about that answer lingered. If what his employees were saying was true, then he wasn't just leading a company. He was presiding over suffering. He needed to see it for himself. The plan was simple. For the next week, he wouldn't be CEO David Carter. He would be Daniel Cole, a middle-aged man with a spotty work history and no managerial experience. His assistant had helped him secure the identity, fake references, a temporary apartment in a lower-income district, and a worn-down wardrobe that matched the part. A brown wig, colored contacts, and a slight hunch in his posture completed the disguise. As he adjusted the name tag clipped to his navy blue uniform, he felt a thrill of nervousness. It had been decades since he worked an entry-level job, and never in a place he owned. He took a deep breath, then stepped through the glass doors of his own company, unnoticed. The store's fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over the aisles, where a handful of employees moved with mechanical efficiency. No one greeted him. No one smiled. A young woman with tired eyes handed him a time card and gestured vaguely toward the back room. "Manager will explain everything." Her voice was devoid of enthusiasm. David, now Daniel, made his way to the stockroom, where the store's floor manager, Greg, was already barking orders at a group of new hires. Greg was a bulky man with thinning hair and a permanent scowl. He barely glanced at David before shoving a clipboard into his hands. "Stock the shelves, don't take too long, and don't ask questions," Greg said flatly. "You get a 10-minute break. If you need water, drink it fast. And if you think this is going to be easy, quit now." The words hit harder than expected. This was how his employees were welcomed. No introductions, no encouragement, just orders. David nodded, biting back the urge to challenge Greg. He had to blend in. The first hour was grueling. Boxes were heavier than they looked, and the pressure to move quickly was relentless. Around him, other employees moved with quiet resignation. He overheard snippets of conversation, concerns about overdue rent, childcare struggles, the constant stress of unreliable schedules. Then came the first real blow. While stacking canned goods, he overheard two employees whispering near the break room door. "I checked my paycheck 3 times. One of them, a young man in a faded uniform, muttered, "It's not enough. I don't know how I'm supposed to make it through the month." His coworker, a woman with hollow cheeks, sighed. "I had to skip dinner last night just to stretch my groceries for the week. And they say we should be grateful to even have jobs." David felt the air leave his lungs. Skipping meals? Choosing between rent and food? This wasn't just corporate noise. It was real, raw struggle. A part of him wanted to speak, to promise that things would change. But he wasn't David Carter right now. He was Daniel Cole, a new hire who knew nothing. The weight of their words settled over him as he continued working, his hands moving mechanically while his mind raced. This wasn't just a job for these people. It was survival, and he had been blind to it. For the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to know what else he would discover. But it was too late to turn back now. The weight of a cardboard box pressed into David's palms as he struggled to balance it on his shoulder. His muscles ached, a reminder that he wasn't used to this kind of labor. The other workers, however, moved without hesitation, their bodies conditioned to the strain. He had barely survived his first day, And now, as the second shift began, the exhaustion had already settled deep into his bones. The difference between him and them, though, was that he could walk away whenever he wanted. They couldn't. Across the aisle, a wiry young man with dark circles under his eyes stacked inventory with practiced efficiency. His name tag read Luis. David had overheard him talking about his college courses the night before a quiet conversation with another worker, while they both inhaled vending machine snacks during their too-short break. Luis caught him watching and offered a half-smile. "First week's always the hardest," he said, shifting a crate into place. "After that, your body just stops fighting it." David adjusted the weight on his shoulder. "That's supposed to be encouraging." Luis gave a dry chuckle. "Not really. Just the truth." David hesitated before lowering his voice. "You said last night you were taking classes. How do you balance school and this?" A shadow crossed Luis's face. "I don't really. I was supposed to cut my hours to study for finals, but my paycheck came up short. Again. So I had to pick up extra shifts." He exhaled sharply, frustration creeping into his voice. "I keep telling myself it's temporary, but every semester, it's the same thing. Rent goes up, hours get cut, and I'm back where I started." David had spent years hearing financial reports, but nothing stung like hearing it from the people living it. A voice cut through the store, sharp and impatient. "Luis, you done flirting, or are you planning to work today?" Both men turned toward Greg, the floor manager, whose scowl was permanently etched into his face. Luis mumbled something under his breath before hurrying back to his station. Greg's gaze settled on David. "And you? Speed it up. You're moving like an old man." David swallowed back his pride. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to learn. By the end of his shift, his back throbbed and his hands were raw from breaking down boxes. He collapsed onto the metal bench in the break room, surrounded by other employees who looked just as drained. A few scrolled through their phones, a temporary escape from reality. Others stared blankly at the wall, too tired to even pretend to be entertained. A woman in her early 40s sat across from him, rubbing her temples. Her uniform was faded, her name tag nearly illegible from wear. "Long shift?" he asked. She let out a bitter laugh. "Aren't they all?" Her name tag read Sharon. He had noticed her working nonstop since his first shift, always moving quickly, rarely pausing. "How long have you been here?" 7 years. She gave him a weary smile. "Don't look so surprised. I've been promoted exactly 0 times." David frowned. 7 years and no raise? She scoffed. "Oh, I've had raises. Pennies at a time. They make a big deal about it, too. Congratulations, Sharon, you get an extra 30 cents an hour." She shook her head. "You know what I did with my last raise? Absolutely nothing. Because 30 cents doesn't mean a damn thing when rent goes up by 200. The anger in her voice wasn't sharp. It was dulled by years of disappointment. David leaned forward. "So why stay?" Sharon's eyes flicked to the break room door as if checking for eavesdroppers. Then she sighed. "Because I don't have a choice. I have 2 kids, and I can't afford to risk losing what little stability I have. Even if it's bad, at least it's something." She paused, then added, "Besides, I keep hoping maybe someone up top will actually listen one day." David's stomach twisted. Before he could respond, another worker stormed into the room, slamming a crumpled piece of paper onto the table. It was a pay stub. "This is a joke," the worker, Marcus, if David remembered correctly, said, his voice shaking with frustration. "I worked 10 extra hours last week. Where the hell is my overtime?" Sharon took one look and shook her head. "Payroll probably missed it. You'll have to call HR. They'll make you wait 2 weeks, then say they're still reviewing the request." Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "That's what they said last time." He ran a hand over his face. "I'm so damn tired of this." David's hands clenched. He had seen payroll reports before. Errors happened, but they weren't supposed to be this common. Sharon turned to Marcus. "You gonna say something? And get written up?" "No thanks." Silence settled over the room, thick with unspoken truths. No one trusted the system to change. No one believed their voices mattered. David had come here expecting to learn about the employee experience. Instead, he was witnessing quiet, everyday suffering, people breaking under a company that barely acknowledged their existence. And it was his company. As he left the break room, Greg's voice barked from the front of the store. "You, Daniel, you're on register." David barely had time to protest before being shoved toward the front lanes. He had avoided cashier duties so far, but now, standing behind the counter, he understood why no one wanted this shift. The lines were endless. Customers were impatient. The register lagged, forcing him to apologize for every delay. Then came the worst part. A mother and her son approached, their cart filled with groceries. David scanned the items quickly, hoping to move the line along, but when he announced the total, the woman's face fell. She pulled out a crumpled stack of bills, counting them twice. Then, quietly, she began removing items from a conveyor belt. David's hands stilled on the register. The boy tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, can we still get the cereal?" She hesitated. Then, barely above a whisper, "Not today, sweetie." The boy's face crumpled, but he said nothing. David had spent years making business decisions from a high-rise office, balancing budgets, cutting costs, approving policies. But standing here, watching a child be denied something as simple as a box of cereal, he realized something with horrifying clarity. Every number on a spreadsheet represented a life. And somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing them. His hands felt cold as he finished the transaction, watching the woman leave with half her groceries abandoned at the register. Greg's voice snapped him back. "Pick it up, Daniel. We don't have all day." David forced himself to move, but something inside him had shifted. This wasn't just about wages. This was about dignity. And for the first time in his career, David's back screamed in protest as he hauled another heavy crate onto the shelf, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the storm raging inside him. He had spent days side by side with employees who barely scraped by, who gave everything to a company that gave them nothing in return. The deeper he sank into their world, the more the weight of his own failures pressed down on him. Luis moved beside him, his motions sharp with irritation. "You okay, man?" he muttered under his breath. "You look like you've seen a ghost." David forced a nod, swallowing the bitter taste in his mouth. He wasn't sure what haunted him more, the fact that he had allowed this to happen under his leadership or the realization that no one expected it to change. The front doors swung open, and a gust of cold air rushed in as a tall man in a tailored suit strode into the store. Regional Manager Anthony Hale. David had met him countless times in boardrooms, where the man's reports always highlighted efficiency, cost-cutting, and streamlined labor strategies. Hale barely acknowledged the employees as he surveyed the floor. Greg, the store manager, rushed to his side like a soldier awaiting orders. "Everything's running smoothly," Greg said quickly, straightening his posture. "Sales are steady, labor costs under control." David's stomach churned. He had read those reports. They were numbers on a page, statistics meant to impress stakeholders. Now he saw what they truly represented. People ground down to their limits. A few feet away, Luis shifted nervously, his fingers tightening around the edge of a shelf. Hale's gaze flicked toward him. "You. What's your name?" Luis hesitated. "Luis, sir." Hale's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You've been here a while, haven't you?" Luis nodded. "Yes, sir. Almost 2 years." "Then you should know better than to leave stock carts in the aisle. Safety violation." Hale's voice was calm, almost pleasant, but the undercurrent of condescension was unmistakable. "If customers trip, we're liable. You want to be the reason someone sues the company." Luis's jaw tightened. "I was in the middle of stocking. There wasn't room in the back, and we're short on staff." Hale's smile vanished. "Excuses don't pay the bills, son. If you can't handle the workload, there are plenty of people who need jobs." David's fists clenched. He had seen enough. His voice came before he could stop himself. "Maybe if we weren't running this place on skeleton crews, there wouldn't be stock carts in the aisles." Silence fell over the store. Hale turned, his eyes narrowing. Greg stiffened. Luis looked stunned. "And you are?" Hale asked, his voice clipped. David hesitated, knowing he was moments away from revealing. The silence stretched unbearably, thick with confusion and tension. Every pair of eyes in the store locked onto David, waiting for an explanation. Hale's expression flickered between annoyance and suspicion, his sharp gaze scanning the unfamiliar face before him. "Who are you?" Hale repeated, his voice a low, warning growl. David exhaled slowly. He had come here to observe, to understand, but there was no more time for pretense. He reached up, gripping the edges of his name tag, and peeled it off. The flimsy plastic felt heavier than it should. "My name isn't Daniel Cole," he said, voice steady but firm. He straightened his posture, abandoning the slight hunch he had adopted as part of his disguise. "I'm David Carter." The room seemed to contract. Someone gasped. A crate slipped from an employee's hands, the contents tumbling across the floor. Greg paled, his jaw going slack. Luis took a step back, as if burned. And Hale, ever composed, only tilted his head slightly, studying him as though seeing him for the first time. David let the moment settle, the weight of his words sinking into everyone present. "I came here undercover because I needed to see for myself what my employees experience every day," he continued. "And I did. I saw the exhaustion, the pressure, the impossible choices you're forced to make just to survive." He turned to Luis, then to the others. "And I heard you. All of you." A murmur rippled through the group. Some looked skeptical. Others looked angry. "You heard us," a woman from the back scoffed. "And what? Now you suddenly care." David flinched. He had expected this reaction, but that didn't make it any easier to hear. "You have every right to be angry," he admitted. "I should have seen it sooner. I trusted reports, numbers, things that don't tell the full story. That was my failure. But I'm here now, and I refuse to let this continue." Hale let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "With all due respect, Mr. Carter, you don't understand the business side of this. You start handing out raises, padding the payroll, and profits will." "Profits will what?" David cut him off sharply. "Dip slightly? Investors might frown. Meanwhile, my employees are skipping meals, working through breaks, and being told they should be grateful for it." His voice rose, years of boardroom polish cracking. "That's not leadership. That's exploitation." The room was deathly silent. Hale's lips pressed into a thin line, his expression unreadable. David turned to Greg. "Your management style needs to change. Effective immediately. No more fear tactics. No more intimidation." His voice was like steel. "If I find out otherwise, you won't be here." Greg's face darkened, but he gave a stiff nod. David inhaled, then looked at the gathered employees. "Starting today, wages will be reevaluated across every store. Break policies will be enforced. Staffing shortages will be addressed." He met Luis's wide-eyed gaze. "And no one should have to choose between rent and food while working full-time." For the first time since he had entered this store, hope flickered in someone's eyes. "Talk is cheap," the same woman from before challenged. "How do we know you'll actually follow through?" David nodded, understanding the doubt. "Because I'll be back," he promised. "Not as a CEO in a suit, but as someone who stands among you, listens to you, and makes sure that change actually happens." The skepticism didn't disappear completely. But this time, there was something else, too. The tiniest, most fragile ember of belief. And David Carter swore, right then and there, that he would never let it die.